Nowadays, no one is surprised by the work of an undercover agent. Special agents all over the world infiltrate criminal groups and try to destroy them by gathering as much evidence as possible. They can play the role of the bad guy for years for the sake of it, every day taking the risk of being exposed or killed. However, this was not always the case. The first operations of this kind were often short and ended with the capture of petty thieves or drug dealers red-handed. The approach began to change in the middle of the 20th century, and our hero today became the first agent in the US who stayed undercover for over 5 years. The result of his work produced data that helped the authorities bring charges against more than 200 American mobsters. Pistone was able to infiltrate first the Colombo family and then the Bonanno family, where he played his role so convincingly that he gained the support of the captain and later street boss Dominick Napolitano, who was going to initiate Pistone's acceptance into the American Mafia. You can see all this in the movie Donnie Brasco with Johnny Depp and Al Pacino, which was based on Pistone's memoirs. However, the movie left a lot out. In this video, I want to remedy that by telling you the real story of Donnie Brasco. So, if you're interested in hearing about how an FBI agent managed to deceive American mobsters for 6 years, balancing between life and death, then meet Joseph Pistone on the side of law and order. Joe Pistone was born in 1939 in Pennsylvania. His first ancestors to set foot on American soil were his grandparents. Some came from Sicily, others from Calabria. Pistone's parents changed residences often while Joe was young, but most of his school years were spent in one New Jersey town called Paterson. The future Donnie Brasco did well in school and played sports, playing on the soccer and basketball teams at his school. Here, he also met his future wife, who eventually had to suffer a lot when he began his introduction to the Mafia. After graduating from high school, Pistone went to university. In parallel, he also had to work to support his pregnant wife. Joe literally took anything he could get, wherever they accepted young men. Bartender, construction worker, or factory worker, he even got a license to drive trucks to bring home more money. When his wife gave birth and recovered, she went to work as a nurse, and Joe, in the meantime, decided to take the police exam. However, he didn't end up getting anywhere with it, as he couldn't combine his studies with on-duty work. When his training was complete, Pistone got a job as a schoolteacher. But at the same time, he was still looking for an opportunity to enter the civil service, because, as Joe himself stated, it was a childhood dream for him. To be more precise, the dream was to become an FBI agent, but at that time it was necessary to work in another law enforcement agency for at least 3 years. So Pistone, having taken a short break in pursuit of his dream to be a teacher, chose between the police and naval intelligence. He had friends in both, so he knew the inner workings firsthand, and ultimately opted for intelligence. At the time, the Office of Navy Intelligence had created a division of civilians to investigate crimes committed on government installations where Navy personnel were based, or crimes committed by Navy personnel in the civilian sector. To work there, you needed a college degree, and not necessarily a bachelor's, a clean reputation, and a successful entrance exam. Joe had all that, so there was no problem getting in, which was fortunate since he had 3 children by that time. By 1969, Pistone had faithfully served the required time in the Navy and applied for a job with the FBI. The application was approved, and after passing the entrance exams in July 1969, Joe was officially hired, becoming a special agent for the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The first thing he had to do in his new position was to undergo 14 weeks of training at the FBI Academy in Quantico, after which Pistone was transferred to Jacksonville, Florida. Joe wasn't covering white-collar crime in Jacksonville, though. He worked the streets, as they say. Catching criminals, finding informants, that sort of thing. His profile back then included fugitive felon cases, gambling, bank robberies, and violating the Mann Act, or transporting people from state to state for prostitution. After 18 months, Pistone was transferred to Alexandria, Virginia, where his main task was to check people running for or being appointed to public office. However, even here and on his own initiative, he did not give up work on criminal offenses. Joe spent 4 years in Alexandria, as well as having undergone several other trainings in Quantico, one of which was just undercover work. For the first time, Pistone began to apply the knowledge he had gained after his transfer to New York in 1974. There, he joined a group that Joe himself calls truckers and hijackers. I think it's clear from the name what they were investigating. And it so happened that he was pretty much the only agent who knew how to drive trucks, so when it was necessary to infiltrate a man into a gang of hijackers that included truck thieves, Pistone was the perfect candidate. He was introduced into the gang by one of the hijackers, who became a government informant. Joe went undercover for several months, and his work resulted in the arrest of a group of more than 30 people, being at the time one of the largest and most prolific groups of hijackers in U.S. history. It was also one of the triggers that started the process of redefining the role of an undercover agent. Prior to that, the work of such agents was largely confined to short buy-and-arrest operations. That is, to generalize, the agent would play a customer like a weapons buyer, for example, and the seller would be arrested during the transaction. Joe had to work undercover with the hijackers for several months, but in the end, they turned out not only catching the small fish, but also decapitating the entire network, proving the usefulness of long-term infiltration. Therefore, when Pistone finished working with the hijackers, the New York office began developing a new operation with a target span of about 6 months. The goal was to gather as much evidence as possible to prosecute the big mafia-linked movers, called fences. Pistone was chosen again for this assignment. He had just successfully completed a major operation and also had Italian roots, which was very important when dealing with guys who were potentially in the mafia and definitely connected to them. Since the operation would last more than days or even weeks, Pistone needed a good cover story. The first, of course, was choosing a name, one that carried over from the last assignment. Joe had once again taken on his alias of Donnie Brasco. It was convenient with the fact that this name already had a social security card, an American Express card, and a driver's license. Next, the past had to be worked on. So Donnie Brasco became an orphan from a burned-down orphanage in Pittsburgh where no record of his pupils remained, turned by the time of the operation into a jewel thief with no wife and children, and a longtime employee in the states of Florida and California. The part of jewelry thief, by the way, was not chosen at random. This is one of the few criminal professions which was suitable for this task, could be performed alone, and most importantly, in 90% of cases excluded violence. So Joe could pretend to work alone and nobody would check the results of his alleged thefts. And if he were offered some armed robbery, he could just say that it wasn't his area and avoid unnecessary problems. To really look like a pro in his business, Pistone studied various alarm systems and video surveillance, also taking a course in gemology, the science of gemstones. The final preparatory step, however, was to destroy any knowledge of Joseph Pistone as an FBI agent. His personal file was removed from public access, and former colleagues thought he had simply quit. Only his inner contact and a couple of higher-ranking agents knew the real reason for his disappearance. When Joe walked out of the FBI office in New York in September 1976, he remained as Pistone to only a very small circle of people. To everyone else, he was now called Donnie Brasco. He had a different car, a different bank account, a different apartment, and, most importantly, a different profession. This time, the Bureau didn't have a man on the inside who could bring Pistone into the organization that they needed to gather evidence on. Joe had to find an opportunity to infiltrate himself, and it was by no means as easy and quick as the movie showed. He didn't just walk into a bar in Little Italy and introduce himself as a jewel thief. Things didn't start out that way. At first, he didn't show up at any of the places in the neighborhood where the wise guys lived. In case you don't know, wise guys are members of the mafia. Pistone started by visiting bars and clubs where the public was diverse and no one would be suspicious of a new face. Guys from the mafia also went to such places, and Pistone's intent was that they got used to his presence. During the first 3 months, Joe only spent time at the bars, drinking and talking to those who would talk to him. He didn't impose himself on anyone. Pistone's reasoning was that once you start asking questions on your own in this environment, you're more likely to be seen as a cop, and eventually no one will want to do business with you. He had to pretend he was just a guy who came here to pass the evening. a guy who wasn't looking to make acquaintances but wouldn't mind making conversation if someone expressed a desire to. Then, when people got used to Pistone being a frequent guest in the same establishments as them, it was necessary to find a way to make his first acquaintances in the same unobtrusive way. The occasion was backgammon, which was played for money in one of the bars by local boys. There were also some wise guys among them. In a short time, Joe mastered the game, and one evening asked permission to join. During the games, Joe managed to further bring the local crowd's guard down and made his first connections. Now, whenever he came to the bar, several people would call out to him, "Hey Donnie, how's it going?" Now, he was no longer a nightly out-of-towner, but his own man. Around the same time, Pistone met a bartender named Marty. Although he wasn't closely associated with the Mafia, he knew a few people from that world. At first, they talked a lot in the bar where Marty worked, and then they started to hang out together. Marty introduced Pistone to some of the wise guys, and also became increasingly interested in what Donnie Brasco did for a living. Joe at first half-jokingly avoided the conversation, but each time he gave the bartender more and more information about his story, which eventually led to the fact that, although Brasco's occupation was not mentioned, Marty was well aware that Donnie was not a law-abiding citizen. So when Pistone brought him a couple of stolen pieces of jewelry to try to sell, Marty wasn't surprised at all. Naturally, after that, the rumor of what Brasco did quickly spread among the local criminal community. Thus, Pistone, without imposing and without attracting unwanted attention, managed to reveal and confirm the identity of Donnie Brasco. Now, he had a base of people who knew him, knew what he did, and in the case of Pistone's further acquaintances with other people, could confirm to these same people that they did not notice anything strange about Donnie. Pistone moved to the next stage of infiltration thanks to another agent named Chuck, who was doing undercover work in the music industry, investigating the influence of organized crime there. Chuck and Pistone would often go to bars together under their made-up identities, and one day Chuck introduced Joe to a guy named Albert, who was connected to the Colombo family and had an uncle initiated in the family. Pistone became friends with Albert. They started going to bars together, celebrating holidays and things like that. And it was Albert in early 1977 who introduced Donnie Brasco to a member of the Colombo family, Jilly Greca, whose team was the first to be infiltrated by Pistone. Jilly himself invited Donnie to his store, where his team gathered in a separate room every day. There, the guys spent most of the day playing cards and discussing potential activities, mostly consisting of robberies. Pretty soon, Brasco became a fixture there. He was even consulted about the alarm system and video surveillance, as well as asked to evaluate jewelry for authenticity. By the way, the incident at the very beginning of the movie, where Donnie tells Lefty that his ring is a fake, in fact occurred with Jilly's crew. Brasco told a wise guy that the diamonds he had stolen were not real. The guy responded with a long argument and even hinted at retaliation if Don was wrong. But in the end, when his fence repeated the same thing to him, he was forced to admit that he was wrong, but at the same time held a grudge against Brasco. This guy had been poking into Jilly's brain for a long time, that Donnie needed to be checked out, although it didn't stop other guys from taking Brasco with them on some of their crimes. Jilly put up with it for a couple of months, but eventually gave in. One day, when Brasco came into the store again, he was taken to a back room and asked to give at least one name of someone he had done business with in Florida or California, so that the wise guys who doubted his reputation could check through their contacts to see if Donnie was telling the truth, and see what that person would say about him. The Bureau had a man for such a case, a thief from Miami who became a secret informant, but he'd been warned about it at the very beginning of the operation in September 1976. It was already the spring of 1977, and there was a chance that the guy might not remember this request. So, having given his name, the chances of Pistone's survival were about 50-50. And all the while that incredulous smartass was trying to find the guy Brasco had named through his men, the undercover agent was kept locked up in the back room of Jilly's store. What a relief it was for Donnie when the guy returned that evening with confirmation from Miami that Donnie Brasco was cool. After that incident, Brasco's communication with Jilly's team gradually died down, but that had less to do with the whole background check situation. For about 6 months, Pistone had been trying to find out through these clever theft specialists who their movers were, because initially the search for big-time fences connected with the Mafia was the main goal, but they wouldn't reveal their contacts. Instead, Pistone was able to successfully gather evidence on the Gilly crew itself, and the Bureau was faced with the question: do we pull Joe out and make arrest, or do we keep him inside? It was decided they would continue the operation but expand their tasks. Not only and as much looking for fences and movers, but the Mafia as a whole. And with such a purpose statement, Gilly Greco was not as interesting as another mafioso who established contact with Pistone at that time, named Tony Mira. So Donnie Brasco began spending less and less time with the Colombo family where Gilly was, and more with the Bonanno family with Tony. Mira was a much bigger fish than Greco. He had served a long sentence for drug dealing, and after getting out of prison was involved in gambling, the jukebox business, extortion, and more drug dealing. Mira started taking Brasco with him frequently, from visiting bars and restaurants to raising money and meeting with other mobsters. Mira also formally introduced Brasco to his captain, Mickey Zaffarano, and introduced him to Benjamin Ruggiero, nicknamed Lefty. Incidentally, the moment in the Donnie Brasco movie where Lefty demands his $8,000 from the guy who slipped him a fake ring was with Mira, not Ruggiero. It was Mira who demanded his money from the guy, and when the guy started making excuses, things started to boil over. Pistone knew that Tony always carried a knife with him, and to avoid bloodshed, with Mira's permission, he took the man aside and explained to him what was about to happen. Besides Brasco hanging out with Mira, he also started spending time with Ruggiero, who didn't mind his presence in his social club. He and Mira even had a sort of rivalry over Donnie, and over who he would officially move with as a family partner. Connected to this eagerness was the fact that Pistone had constructed an image for Brasco as a fairly successful thief. He would occasionally bring in and show the results of his alleged thefts, which included tens of thousands of dollars worth of jewelry and gems. And the mafioso who was to take him under his wing would receive part of the profits from these thefts. The jewelry, on the other hand, was taken out of confiscated items from past arrest. Some of them couldn't find an owner, so they were put to work. Eventually, Brasco in the movie was put on the team with Lefty. Mira fled town in 1977 to hide from prosecution, so Ruggiero hustled up and claimed Donnie as his man. And here I propose to deviate a little from the story of Pistone's introduction into the Mafia and talk about Lefty, since he played an equally significant role in the movie. I want to talk about his backstory, as well as the difference between how Ruggiero was presented in the movie and how he was in reality. Lefty was born in New York City in 1926. At a very young age, he joined the Bonanno family. He was accepted into the Mafia in 1977, and was a soldier under the command of Capo Mike Sabella. The basis of Ruggiero's earnings was gambling, namely marking bets, along with extortion and underground usury. Also, Lefty was considered one of the top killers of the family at the time. He accounted for about 30 murders. Much like in the movie, he was a full-out gambler, constantly in debt because of this. In particular, in 1977, he had to quickly repay a debt of $160,000. Otherwise, he would not have been accepted into the family. However, unlike the Al Pacino character in the movie who portrayed Lefty as some kind of laughingstock who had achieved nothing in life, the real Ruggiero had much more respect in the ranks of the Mafia, and at times was an acting capo. And if not for Pistone's operation, he could have become one on a permanent basis. Another part where the movie is more than faintly different from reality is the friendship that developed between Ruggiero and Pistone as Brasco. Donnie never suggested that Lefty buy a boat and sail away to save himself from the mob and the law, and never considered their relationship to be friendly. Moreover, Ruggiero angered Pistone greatly with his behavior. Pistone's closest relationship was with Sonny Black. There was indeed a semblance of what could be called a friendship. But there was also some truth about Lefty in the movie. He really didn't like the cold, and he was afraid of getting cold. That moment where he froze in the room was also real. The guys decided to play a joke on him and turn the air conditioner to the minimum, and Lefty couldn't figure out how to turn it off. The lion, by the way, was also real. Only the circumstances of its acquisition were a little different, but the fact itself is true. Lefty's acquaintance with Brasco, as I said earlier, was different from in the movie. At first, it was just socializing. Then Ruggiero slowly started pulling Donnie into the business. First on the basis of collecting debts, and then he was asked to take bets in the bookie's office, and later for him to travel and report on gambling operations in the place of family underboss, Nicky Marangello. Brasco in all cases presented himself perfectly, and in addition earned well for himself on the side with thefts. So Lefty, having previously asked for Donnie to be on the streets, officially secured him for himself as a partner. After that, the training began, also similar to what was in the movie. Shave off the mustache, be respectful of wise guys, be always on call, and stuff like that. Their approach of doing things together changed after that. Lefty started dragging Donnie into almost everything. Fraud, theft, bookmaking, loan sharking, extortion, you name it. Over years of infiltration, Pistone had done more than a few of these kinds of operations, but I'll keep from talking about them since they don't affect the overall course of events, and their weight isn't that important. The first was related to Milwaukee and the local mafia family led by Frank Balistreri. The FBI introduced an agent in this city under the name of Tony Conti, who was supposed to pretend to be a vending machine salesman and start trying to promote his services to the owners of local bars and stores. The Bureau expected that the local mobsters, who controlled the business practically all over Milwaukee, would try to threaten to drive Conti out of their territory, and as a result get punished by the criminals. However, nothing happened. Simply no one wanted to do business with Conti. The owners of bars and shops just turned him down, and the mafiosi, seeing the failures of the rundown businessman, did not make contact. Then the bosses decided to try and get involved there and with the Bonanno family, using Agent Pistone to reach the Milwaukee family. Joe, in the role of Donnie Brasco, began talking to Lefty here and there about the subject, as if in passing, when the opportunity presented itself. He would bring up a friend who decided to go into the vending machine business. In this way, he marked the existence of Tony Conti for Ruggiero, and then waited for the opportune moment to offer to help him open a business in Milwaukee. Such an opportunity very soon presented itself when Lefty needed money urgently. Brasco told him that his friend from Milwaukee could lend it to him, mentioning that he had a lot of money saved up that he would like to invest in the vending machine business, and to open he needed the help of a wise guy to negotiate with the local wise guys, which was a good opportunity to make money. Being in a bad financial situation, as almost always, Ruggiero took the bait, and while Brasco clarified that Conti's initial capital was about a couple of $100,000, he immediately began to think of options for how to negotiate with the local family. First, Lefty personally met with Conti, found out how much money he had, and shook out $2,500 for expenses. Then Ruggiero went to his captain, Mike Sabella, to contact his boss, Carmine Galanti, who had to give permission for this venture. Galanti approved the idea, and Ruggiero and Sabella started looking for leads on the Milwaukee family. One guy knew another guy, that guy knew a third, and so gradually they came across people who would organize a meeting with Balistreri. At the meeting itself, everything went well. Ruggiero made a deal with Balistreri. Conti was allowed to work in Milwaukee, but he had to pay both the local family and Lefty. However, the deal fell through at the very last minute. Either Conti was flirting with Balistreri's mistress, or he simply suspected something was up, but the Milwaukee boss just stopped contacting him. And since no one knew whether Tony had been exposed or not, it was decided not to risk it and leave him out of the game. Everything was arranged so that Lefty would think that Conti was either killed or just took the money and ran away from him. Although the operation failed, the information that had already been gathered would serve well in the future when Balistreri was put on trial. Conti would indeed be exposed later on, but Pistone was lucky enough not to have to be pulled from undercover. Balistreri found out about this fact, but for some reason didn't report it to New York. Most likely, he didn't want anyone else to know that he was introducing the undercover agent to people as his friend, and even wanted to form a business partnership with him. Conti had been taken out of the game by then, Everyone thought he was missing, and the Milwaukee boss simply didn't release knowledge of Conti beyond his organization. The second operation worth focusing on was the one involving Florida and the Tampa mob boss, Santo Trafficante. This part was touched on only a bit in the Donnie Brasco movie. It took place some time after the attempted link-up with Milwaukee, and during that period something changed within the Bonanno family itself. Before that, the de jure boss was Rusty Rastelli, who was in jail, but the de facto running of the family was done on the streets by Carmine Galanti. He was a peculiar guy and many didn't like him, so in 1979 he was eliminated, and the family had a small reshuffle. Mike Sabella was demoted to soldier, and his team was taken by Dominick Napolitano, nicknamed Sonny Black, who was promoted to just the opposite. Sonny was Rastelli's confidant, helping him run the family from prison. Brasco, along with Lefty, were also transferred from Sabella to Napolitano. Not everyone was happy with the arrangement, and an opposition to Rastelli's power was formed, wherein the key players were Alphonse Indelicato, nicknamed Sonny the Red, Dominic Trinchera, and Philip Giaccone. This would later lead to open conflict, but for now, everyone pretended that all was well. Pistone, on the other hand, was again ordered to help another agent at this point. This time it had to do with Florida and the territory where Santo Trafficante was in charge. There, an agent named Tony Rossi was trying to infiltrate the gambling business and make contact with Trafficante. Rossi opened a club called the Royal Court, and in addition to the dance floor and bar, he organized underground poker games there. Gradually, some second-rate wise guys and corrupt cops started reaching out to him. All of them had to pay, but none of them had contact with Trafficante. Then it was decided to try to interest the Bonanno family to become a partner in this club. From there, they could move and get to Trafficante. Again, Pistone as Brasco spent a long time laying the ground for this proposal. When he had to make a point, he would mention Florida, his friend there, what he was doing, what problems he was having, and so on. This went on from late fall 1979 to early February 1980, when he finally told Ruggiero that this guy from Florida was asking to partner with him to get rid of the annoying, second-rate wise guys who were just sucking money out of him without any connections to help him expand. Lefty was interested and personally went to see the Royal Court, which made a good impression on him. During the same visit, Ruggiero had a word with all the wise guys who were prying into Rossi's affairs, saying that they should look for another club to do their business, since Lefty from New York was now a partner there. However, scaring off the small-time gangsters was one thing, and making a deal with a different family already in the area was another. A bigger man's help was needed here, and Ruggiero traveled to New York to ask Sonny Black for assistance. Having heard from Lefty how cool the place could be with a little investment, Napolitano decided to go personally to see what this royal court in Florida was that could make them so rich. Once there, Napolitano saw even more possibilities than Ruggiero had before. First, he made Brasco the boss of the royal court, who besides being in charge of organized poker games and the club's expansion, also led the placement and acceptance of bets and underground loan sharking. In addition, Sonny planned to organize bingo games and so-called Las Vegas nights. This is what they called floating casinos, where an illegal casino was organized in a club or bar for one night. In the movie Donnie Brasco, you may have seen a similar Vegas night where they got raided by the police. In reality, this scene did happen, but Sonny Red had nothing to do with it. The cops, on a tip from another club owner, raided the place and pocketed 20 grand for themselves. Napolitano was told these same plans by Santo Trafficante, and he approved the Bonanno family's presence on his property for a percentage of whatever they planned to run there. And while the negotiations weren't on any FBI boat, like in the movie, the partying on the Abscam yacht was just as real, and Brasco barely got away with it when the real owner of the vessel was revealed. Something else that really happened, like in the movie, was that after the Trafficante deal, there was some slight friction between Ruggiero and Napolitano. Lefty didn't like the fact that Sonny had put Brasco in charge of the royal court and ordered him to report to him directly, bypassing Ruggiero. However, it didn't lead to any confrontation or open conflicts. The only thing that changed after this decision by Napolitano is that Brasco started communicating less and less with Lefty and more with Sonny Black. First off, he was higher in rank and more valuable to Pistone's Napolitano operation. And secondly, in principle, the agent did not like Ruggiero, who behaved like an asshole. He constantly pulled money from him, treated him like a second-class citizen, and thought that Donnie owed him. And although in business matters Ruggiero always defended Brasco, in personal communication, Donnie liked Napolitano more. He said that he could be a regular guy when alone with him, and he could just sit and talk as a friend, not like some mafioso who was above him in rank. That's why he bonded more with Sonny rather than Ruggiero. And near the end of the Napolitano operation, he actually began to trust Brasco almost more than anyone else in his entourage, promising him that in as soon as a couple of months, with boss Rusty Rastelli out of prison, Donnie would be accepted into the family. Meanwhile, things were moving forward in Florida. Illegal operations were expanding, and agents Rossi and Pistone were gathering intelligence. In New York, relations between the Rastelli and Indelicato factions began to escalate, culminating in the former's victory. In the movie, you can see this when Sonny Black's team waxed 3 guys. It was about the same in real life. They scheduled a meeting between the 4 captains, Alphonse Indelicato, Dominic Trinchera, Felipe Giacone, and Bruno Indelicato. Only Bruno failed to show up, and after the first 3 were killed, their supporters defected to Rastelli's side. Bruno, who was Sonny Red's son, received a contract on his life that was handed to Donnie Brasco. The only difference from the movie was that Brasco was not present at the scene of the murders and only found out about them after the fact. These events made the Bureau worried about Pistone's fate. At the time, no one had any idea how the murder of the 3 captains would be perceived. A fierce war could very well break out, as Sonny Red clearly wanted payback for his son Bruno, and Donnie Brasco, who had been given the contract to kill him, could well be one of the first victims of that war. So there was a question of whether to end the operation. Pistone, of course, was against it. He had been undercover for over 5 years. For over 5 years, he spent almost every day among the mobsters, earning a great reputation. He ran a business in Florida for the Bonanno family and had the trust of one of the most reputable wise guys in the clan. Best of all, it was worth waiting it out a few months when he would be accepted into the family, allowing Pistone to become the first FBI agent to be initiated into the Mafia. At that rate, continuing to work could simply destroy the Bonanno family, wiping it off the country's crime radar. However, his superiors felt that the immediate risks outweighed the potential rewards and took Pistone out of the game. 2 days later, FBI agents came to Napolitano's social club and told Sonny that Donnie Brasco was actually an employee of the Bureau. The disclosure of this fact immediately put both Napolitano and Ruggiero in jeopardy. The former, at the time, was in an unspoken struggle for power in the family with Joe Massino, who used this fact to justify the need to eliminate Napolitano. Tony Mira, who first brought Pistone into the family, was also killed, and Ruggiero was arrested on his way to the meeting where he would have been eliminated. Lefty ended up getting 20 years in prison and refused to make a deal with the authorities, which earned him a canceled contract on his life. He was released in 1993 on parole and died a year later of lung cancer. Pistone, however, spent another year helping various prosecutors put wise guys behind bars. He was involved in the trials of the Bonanno family, the Milwaukee family, the Tampa family, and the Philadelphia family. He helped in the commission case where Giuliani planned to lock up the bosses of all 5 families at once. He advised in the pizza parlor case, one of the largest heroin smuggling operations in Mafia history, and consulted on other smaller cases. And even when he temporarily left the service from 1986 to 92 due to conflict with his immediate superiors, Joe still continued to help build cases against the American Mafia with his testimonies. In all, he helped bring charges against more than 200 wise guys across the country. In 1992, when he rejoined the service, Pistone continued his undercover work. Of course, he didn't have such long-lasting operations now, but his ability to impersonate a mafioso came in handy more than once. He worked, for example, in conjunction with Scotland Yard, portraying an American wise guy at the conclusion of a deal with the Chinese triad, purchased drugs in the Caribbean to catch the sellers red-handed, and in general had a good ride with missions around the world. On the side, Joe has managed to write several books, sell the movie rights to his story, and work as an expert on undercover work, lecturing about it around the globe. At the moment, Pistone is over 80 years old, but he continues to stay public despite the fact that, as he himself states, he still has a $500,000 hit open on his head from the Mafia. On YouTube, you can find more than a few interviews or podcasts with his participation. Many presenters note that to this day, Pistone cannot fully take off his mafioso mask. It seems that after 6 years of working among wise guys, his mask has become too attached to his true personality.